Hi, my name is Cami Ross. I work in the Office of Education Abroad at Case Western Reserve University. And today we're talking more about learning across cultures, cultural dimensions. So cultural dimensions are really the think piece behind Gerrit Hofstede's research. In the 1960s, he was brought in as a social psychologist to really examine how IBM was having business differences across the world. Not a lot of research had been done into cultural differences, and so he really wanted to quantify some data. So what he did was he identified a few dimensions to look at and then started creating data maps to see what synthesis he could find, what were some commonalities, or some things that maybe were outliers. As you can see from this particular example, the New York City office versus the Mumbai office, he started seeing clusters form with his data. Then as those clusters formed, he started also seeing how different countries were clustered in different areas. A lot of this is how he was able to better identify country associations with cultural dimensions. Now, all of this data is well and good, but please recognize that there are, of course, outliers. What this really was done was to create a starting point as you're traveling or as you're working with people from different countries. This will give you an opportunity to think what some of the commonalities might be for the nation that they're from. And then you can work from there. So yes, you might say, but my friend isn't like that at all. And that's probably the case. But this is about generalizations with research that help you better form cultural connections. So some of the cultural pieces that he was really looking, and some of these have been added since his original research. His original research was honestly just with IBM, and it's since been expanded to be a worldwide network. It's been given hundreds of thousands of times, communities across the world. And, you know, as it was expanding in his research, he started seeing different dimensions come up. I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these, but they're basically individualism and collectivism, uncertainty avoidance, masculinity versus femininity, long-term orientation, short-term, indulgence and restraint, and power distance. So each of these, be it from your own culture or others, has its own advantages. And that's very important to keep in mind. It's not that there's a dimension that's better than the other. It just has different aspects to it. So for example, with individualism, you have self-reliance. You have that get up and go attitude. Group orientation is independence and the ability to help one another. Hierarchical orientation for power distance is more about discipline. As opposed to participative in power distance, which is acceptance of responsibility. Uncertainty index, we're talking about precision or maybe innovation. For achievement, it's about efficiency or maybe custom outputs and personal service. Time orientation, it might be developing new opportunities for long-term, as opposed to adapting quickly if you're more on the short-term orientation. And indulgence is a sense of well-being and wholeness, as opposed to more of a work ethic. So I'm going to go a little bit more in depth, but I wanted to start out with some of these positives. So individualism and collectivism, I pulled from our larger student populations at Case Western, China, India, and compared to the United States. So the United States, as you might guess, is an individualistic country. The history of our immigration came about from those that were fleeing their own countries, often due to persecution, so they could have their own religion and have their own communities and have their own rules in the United States. A lot of that is still persistent today in our culture as more of an I mentality versus a we mentality. You know, and most Americans think about themselves as opposed to seeing their answers more in a complex network of community or family. So a good example that I pulled is from McDonald's. So the left is from Sweden and the right is from China. On the left, a much more individualistic country, the McDonald's marketing team realized that Swedes want to make decisions for themselves. What is in the food? Where does it come from? How can you make a choice that's best for you? There are a lot of options, a lot of navigating, and a lot of decision making. On the right, it's China. McDonald's looked at that, and honestly, the photo is associated with birthday party advertisements. You can see they're using people from different walks of life, from different age groups to show, you know, this is what people are doing and enjoying. There's a lot less about making decisions yourself, but more about what the sales are, what are the community ideas doing. Obviously, collectivism and individualism can be very different in different settings, but I thought this was kind of a fun way to look at it. So power distance is your ability to understand if you're in an equal team or if you're in more of a hierarchical structure. So a lot of times the example given for this is businesses. How does the team work? Do you have a very strong leader where everyone works to make the leader's job easier or better? Or is it more that everyone's on equal footing? As the team succeeds, everyone is able to receive similar accolades. You can see this as a chef in a kitchen who's barking out orders because of their great experience, or more of a community co-op kind of example. In terms of classes, is the professor in front of the class orating so that way you regurgitate their information? Or is it group work where you're going to maybe talk to your professor on a first name basis and your ideas can really contribute to the results of the class? For uncertainty avoidance, this has a lot to do with rules. I used an example of a car, like traffic in India, because I think cars and traffic are a really good way to think about it. In India, the traffic goes in such a way that there aren't lights, there aren't lines. No one's really using their turn signal the way that they do in other places in the world. And so there's a lot of a low uncertainty avoidance. It's much more go with the flow, see how things are going, kind of try to inch your way up whenever possible on your own opportunities, as opposed to rules. So in Germany, the Autobahn was famous for having no speed limit. At the same time, if you travel there, there are speed limits posted as suggested speed limits. And from my personal experience, people pretty much go those expected speed limits. It's because they're understanding the rules, they're understanding maybe the benefits that come with following the rules. A lot of it has to come into play, especially for academics. Maybe, you know, the syllabus is laid out. You need this done at this point, this done at this point. Low uncertainty avoidance, you know, so long as you get it done, isn't that what matters? You'll see that kind of viewpoint different places in the world in terms of getting projects done. So long-term versus short-term orientation. As you can see, China has a very long-term orientation. A lot of the culture is based on history, is based on, maybe what the next generation can do as opposed to what we can do in the here and now. How are you really planning for the future? And how are you reflecting on the past? In terms of the United States, that all goes up in the wind. It really is about living for the now. Carpe diem, take advantage of the day. When we're talking about climate change, when we're talking about traditions, they're not having the same weight as other places in the world. Indulgence is one of the newest dimensions in Hofstede's research. This really has to do with work-life balance. It is sometimes considered to be called femininity or masculinity. This is where the United States has more on the work ethic side as opposed to the life balance side. And that often comes into play with how vacation is taken and things like that. So that is the end of our review of Hofstede's dimensions. I hope you learned a little bit. If you want to find out more, there's a lot of information and you can actually do your own little graphs on his website for free. It's a country analysis tool and you're able to compare. And there is further information and write-ups about some of those dimensions that are country specific.